The gunshot echoed across the valley, sending a flock of startled birds into the amber sky as Daisy Newcomb clutched her infant son tighter to her chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not from the distant violence but from the painful truth that had become impossible to ignore. They hadn't eaten in nearly 2 days, and little Thomas's cries were growing weaker by the hour. The drought of 1878 had turned the Nebraska territory into a wasteland of broken promises. 6 months ago, when her husband William had succumbed to typhoid fever, Daisy had believed she could manage their small homestead alone. Now, as she stood at the edge of their parched cornfield, the reality of her situation crashed down upon her like an avalanche. The crops had failed, the well was running dry, and her milk was diminishing along with her strength. "Just a little longer, my sweet boy," she whispered, her cracked lips brushing against Thomas's forehead. "Mama will figure something out." But what? The nearest neighbor was 10 miles away, and she couldn't bear the thought of walking into town and facing the pitying stares of the townsfolk. They'd warned her against trying to run the homestead alone. "A woman with a baby has no business farming," they'd said. The memory of their condescending tones made her spine stiffen with resolve. No, she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of being right. William had believed in her strength, had told her with his dying breath that she was the most capable woman he'd ever known. She would not dishonor his memory by admitting defeat. Daisy trudged back toward the small cabin, wincing as each step sent waves of hunger pangs through her empty stomach. The larder held nothing but a handful of dried beans and half a cup of flour. She'd stretched it as far as she could, but there was no denying the truth any longer. They needed help. The sun was beginning to set when she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. Clutching Thomas protectively, she peered through the cabin's single window. A lone rider approached, his broad-shouldered silhouette backlit by the dying sunlight. Daisy's hand instinctively moved toward the shotgun propped beside the door. Since William's passing, drifters occasionally stopped by, some with intentions that made her grateful for her husband's insistence that she learn to shoot. The rider slowed as he neared the cabin, and Daisy could make out more details now: a tall man atop a chestnut mare, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on solid ground. "Hello, the house," he called, his voice deep and clear. "Anyone home?" Daisy remained silent, watching through the window as the stranger tied his horse to the hitching post. Her eyes narrowed as she noticed the cattle brand on his saddlebag, the Valero Ranch. She'd heard of them, a large operation that had moved into the territory last year, buying up failed homesteads one by one. "I don't mean to intrude, madam," the man called again. "Name's Garrett Valero. I was riding fence line and thought I'd check if everything's all right." "Haven't seen smoke from your chimney in a few days." Daisy hesitated. Pride warred with necessity as Thomas squirmed in her arms, letting out a weak whimper that tore at her heart. She couldn't sacrifice her child on the altar of her stubbornness. Drawing a deep breath, she opened the door but kept the shotgun visible at her side. "We're managing just fine, Mr. Valero," she said, her voice steadier than her trembling hands. "Thank you for your concern." The man Garrett removed his hat, revealing a face younger than she'd expected, perhaps no more than 30 years. His eyes, the warm brown of strong coffee, met hers with an open, honest gaze that momentarily disarmed her. "Begging your pardon, madam, but you don't look like you're managing fine," he said softly, his gaze moving from her gaunt face to the thin baby in her arms. "When's the last time you ate?" The direct question pierced through her defenses, bringing a flush of embarrassment to her cheeks. "That's hardly your business, Mr. Valero." His expression remained gentle, without a trace of the pity she so dreaded. "Maybe not. But I've got a fresh killed rabbit in my saddlebag and more food than one man needs. Would be a kindness if you'd help me not waste it." Thomas chose that moment to let out a more insistent cry, his tiny fists balling against her chest. The sound seemed to echo Daisy's own body's protests against her stubbornness. Garrett glanced at the baby, then back to her face. The little one sounds hungry. He's fine, Daisy insisted, but her voice cracked, betraying her. The cowboy's gaze remained steady, not challenging her obvious lie but not accepting it either. With deliberate slowness, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle. The smell that wafted from it as he unfolded the cloth made Daisy's stomach clench painfully. "Madam, I'm not offering charity," he said quietly. "Consider it being neighborly. My pa always said a community only survives when folks look out for each other." Daisy's grip on the shotgun loosened. The man before her didn't have the look of someone with ulterior motives, and Thomas's cries were growing more desperate. "One meal," she finally conceded, stepping back from the doorway, "and I'll repay you as soon as I'm able." A smile crossed Garrett's weathered face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. Fair enough. He stepped inside, ducking his tall frame through the low doorway, and Daisy noticed the respectful way he wiped his boots before entering her home. Without being asked, he moved to the cold stove and began preparing to light it. "Would you mind if I cook this up for us?" he asked, indicating the rabbit and some vegetables he'd pulled from his saddlebag. "Please," Daisy said, the single word costing her more pride than she cared to admit. As Garrett busied himself with starting the fire and preparing the meal, Daisy settled into the rocking chair with Thomas. The baby continued to fuss, and she knew her milk had diminished to almost nothing after days of near starvation. "Here," Garrett said suddenly, approaching with a small canteen. "It's fresh cow's milk. I was bringing it home for my coffee, but your little one needs it more." Daisy stared at the offered canteen, torn between desperate gratitude and stubborn pride. "Mrs.?" he questioned softly. "Newcomb," she supplied. "Daisy Newcomb, and this is Thomas." "Mrs. Newcomb," Garrett continued, "I lost my ma when I was young. Fever took her. Pa always said the hardest thing she ever did was ask for help when she needed it, said it took more courage than facing down a grizzly." He extended the canteen again. "Reckon you've got that kind of courage?" The simple question, asked without judgment or condescension, broke something loose inside her. A single tear slid down Daisy's cheek as she reached for the canteen. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. Garrett merely nodded and returned to his cooking, giving her the privacy to feed her son. Thomas drank eagerly, his small body relaxing as the sustenance filled his empty stomach. The aroma of cooking rabbit and vegetables soon filled the cabin, making Daisy dizzy with hunger. When Garrett finally brought her a plate, she had to force herself not to devour it like a starving animal. "Eat slow," he advised gently. "Your stomach won't be used to much food." They ate in companionable silence, broken only by Garrett's occasional comment about the weather or his observations about the land. He never asked why she was alone, never questioned how she'd come to such dire straits, and Daisy found herself gradually relaxing in his presence. After the meal, when Thomas had fallen into a contented sleep, Garrett finally broached the subject she'd been dreading. "Mrs. Newcomb," he began, his hands folded on the rough-hewn table. "I don't mean to pry, but is there anyone who can help you? Family nearby?" Daisy shook her head. "My parents are back east. William, my husband, he brought us out here for a fresh start." She swallowed hard. "He died 6 months ago, typhoid." Garrett's expression softened. "I'm mighty sorry to hear that." "The crops failed this year," she continued, the words spilling out now that she'd begun. "The well's almost dry. I've been trying to hold on until harvest, but—" She gestured helplessly at the barren fields visible through the window. "That's a heavy burden to carry alone," Garrett said quietly. "I don't need pity, Mr. Valero," Daisy said, her spine stiffening. "And I'm not offering any," he replied evenly. "What I am offering is work." Daisy blinked in surprise. "Work?" Garrett nodded. "My ranch needs help. We've got a cook who's getting on in years and could use an assistant. It's honest work with room and board for you and your boy." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "You wouldn't have to give up your land, just put it aside until you're in a better position." The offer stunned her. It wasn't charity, it was a chance, a way to keep her dignity while ensuring Thomas would be fed. "I don't know the first thing about cooking for a ranch," she admitted, Garrett's lips quirked up in a half-smile. "Can you make biscuits that don't break teeth? Because that'd already be an improvement on Cookie's efforts." Despite everything, Daisy found herself smiling back. "I can manage that much." "Then you're hired, Mrs. Newcomb." He rose to his feet. "I'll come back tomorrow with a wagon if that suits you." Daisy hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Yes, that would be fine, thank you." After Garrett left, promising to return the next day, Daisy sat in the silence of her cabin, Thomas sleeping peacefully in her arms. For the first time in months, the weight on her shoulders felt slightly lighter. She had made a decision not to surrender her homestead but to retreat strategically. William would have understood that wasn't the same as giving up. True to his word, Garrett arrived the next morning with a wagon and 2 ranch hands to help load Daisy's few belongings. She locked the cabin door with a strange mixture of regret and relief, then climbed into the wagon seat with Thomas bundled securely in her arms. The journey to the Valero ranch took most of the morning. As they crested the final hill, Daisy caught her breath at the sight spread before her: a sprawling main house, several outbuildings, corrals filled with horses, and vast pastures dotted with cattle. "It's not as grand as it looks," Garrett said, noticing her expression. "My father built it piece by piece over 20 years. Started with just a 1-room cabin not much different from yours." The main house was indeed impressive up close, a 2-story structure built of solid timber with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. As they approached, a gray-haired woman emerged, wiping her hands on an apron. "Mrs. Newcomb, this is Mrs. Harris, our housekeeper," Garrett introduced them. "She'll get you and Thomas settled." Mrs. Harris had a no-nonsense manner that immediately set Daisy at ease. She showed them to a small but comfortable room at the back of the house, explained the ranch routine, and then left Daisy to unpack her meager belongings. "Dinner's at 6 sharp," the older woman called over her shoulder. "And Mr. Valero says you're to rest today. Tomorrow's soon enough to start earning your keep." The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity as Daisy settled into life at the ranch. Working alongside Cookie, a gruff old man with surprising patience, she quickly learned the rhythm of feeding the dozen ranch hands who depended on hearty meals to fuel their long days of work. Thomas thrived in the bustling environment, cooed over by Mrs. Harris and even the toughest cowboys. With regular meals, Daisy's own strength returned, and with it a quiet determination to learn everything she could about making a homestead successful. Garrett often stopped by the kitchen, ostensibly to check on operations but increasingly to engage Daisy in conversation. She learned that he'd taken over the ranch 2 years earlier when his father retired to a warmer climate for his health. At 28, Garrett shouldered immense responsibility, yet he carried it with a steady confidence that Daisy couldn't help but admire. One evening, about a month after her arrival, Garrett found Daisy sitting on the porch after dinner, Thomas sleeping in a makeshift cradle beside her. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair. Daisy nodded her permission, and they sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching as the setting sun painted the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. "I rode by your homestead today," Garrett said eventually. "Checked that everything was secure." Daisy's heart tightened with unexpected longing. "How did it look?" "Standing strong," he replied. "Though the land's still suffering from the drought," he hesitated. "Mrs. Newcomb, Daisy, if I may, I've been thinking about your situation." She tensed slightly. "Oh. That creek that runs along the east edge of my property continues through the northern corner of your land," he said. "With some work and planning, we could divert some of the water to irrigate your fields come spring." Daisy turned to look at him, surprise evident in her expression. "You do that?" Garrett met her gaze steadily. "It would benefit us both. More successful homesteads mean a stronger community." A slight smile crossed his face. Besides, I've grown accustomed to your apple pies. Be a shame if you moved back and took that talent too far away." The comment drew a genuine laugh from Daisy, and she realized it was the first time she'd laughed since William's death. The sound startled her, bringing a flush to her cheeks. As autumn deepened into winter, Daisy found herself increasingly drawn to Garrett. His quiet strength reminded her of William, but there was something different to a gentleness, a patience that came from growing up with enough rather than always scraping by. He began teaching her about ranching in his spare time, explaining cattle breeding, showing her how to calculate grazing needs, discussing water management for dry years. Daisy soaked up the knowledge eagerly, recognizing its value for when she eventually returned to her homestead. The first snow came in early November, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. That evening, after Thomas was asleep and the kitchen cleaned, Garrett invited Daisy to join him in the study. "I have something to show you," he said, unrolling a map across his desk. Daisy leaned forward, recognizing the survey lines of the surrounding properties. "This is your homestead," Garrett said, pointing to a rectangle marked with the name Newcomb, "and here's my east pasture." His finger moved to an adjacent parcel. "I've been thinking about this irrigation idea. With your permission, I'd like to have my men start the work once the ground thaws in spring." Daisy stared at the map, then at Garrett's earnest face. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. Something flickered in his eyes, vulnerability, perhaps. "Because I admire you, Daisy. Your courage, your determination. Most folks would have given up and gone back east after what you've endured." "I considered it," she admitted, "many times. But you didn't," he said simply. "You faced impossible odds and kept fighting. That kind of spirit deserves a chance to succeed." Their eyes met, and Daisy felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the crackling fire in the hearth. For the first time since William's death, she felt a flicker of something beyond grief and determination, a fragile, tentative hope. The moment was broken by a commotion outside, shouting voices and the sound of horses arriving at a gallop. Garrett strode to the window, his expression immediately hardening. "Stay here," he said, grabbing his coat and hat. Naturally, Daisy ignored the instruction, following him onto the porch where several ranch hands had gathered around two riders. 3 men hit the Henderson place, one of the riders was saying, his breath forming clouds in the cold night air. "Took everything of value and burned the rest." "Henderson's barely got out alive." "Raiders?" Garrett asked, his voice tight. The rider nodded. "Same bunch that's been hitting isolated homesteads all through the territory, sheriffs putting together a posse at first light." Daisy felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "My cabin," Garrett turned to her, understanding immediately. "I'll send 2 men to check on it tonight." "No," Daisy said firmly, "I'm going with them." His expression shifted to one of concern. "Daisy, it's dangerous, it's my home," she interrupted. "Everything I have left of William is there. I'm going." They argued briefly, but in the end, Garrett himself accompanied Daisy, leaving Thomas in Mrs. Harris's capable hands. The ride through the snow-covered landscape was tense and silent, both of them scanning the darkness for any sign of trouble. As they approached the Newcomb homestead, Daisy's breath caught in her throat. In the pale moonlight, she could see that the door of her cabin stood open, swinging slightly in the night breeze. Garrett drew his pistol. "Stay behind me," he murmured, dismounting and approaching cautiously. The interior of the cabin had been ransacked, furniture overturned, the few remaining provisions scattered. Daisy moved instinctively to the loose floorboard beneath the bed where she'd hidden William's pocket watch and her wedding ring before leaving. To her relief, the hiding place remained undiscovered. "They're long gone," Garrett said, holstering his weapon. "Probably moved on after finding so little worth taking." Daisy clutched the recovered treasures, fighting back tears. The violation of her home, meager as it was, felt like a final blow. "We should head back," Garrett said gently. "It's not safe to linger." As they secured the cabin and prepared to leave, the sound of approaching horses froze them in place. Garrett immediately pushed Daisy behind him, drawing his pistol again. "Get to the back and be ready to run," he whispered urgently. Before they could move, 3 riders appeared in the clearing, illuminated by moonlight reflected off the snow. Garrett's stance relaxed slightly as he recognized the sheriff's badge on the lead rider's chest. "Valero," the sheriff acknowledged with a nod. "Mrs. Newcomb, you're a ways from the ranch tonight. Checking on the property, Sheriff Collins," Garrett replied. "Heard about the Hendersons and wanted to make sure Mrs. Newcomb's place was secure." The sheriff dismounted, stomping his boots to restore circulation. "Caught up to those raiders about 5 miles south. There was a disagreement about them surrendering." His tone made it clear how that disagreement had ended. "Found this in their saddlebags." He held out a small object that Daisy recognized with a gasp, a carved wooden horse that William had made for their unborn child while they journeyed west. "That's mine," she said, stepping forward. "They took it from here." The sheriff handed it over with a sympathetic nod. "Figured as much. They'd hit at least 6 homesteads that we know of. Won't be bothering anyone else now." After the sheriff and his deputies continued their rounds, Garrett insisted they return to the ranch immediately. The ride back was quieter but less tense now that the immediate danger had passed. As they approached the Valero ranch, snowflakes began to fall again, soft and silent in the night air. Garrett suddenly reined his horse to a stop, turning to face Daisy. "I need to say something," he said, his voice unusually hesitant. "Tonight made me realize I can't keep pretending." Daisy's heart quickened. "Pretending what?" "That I offered you work just to be neighborly." His eyes held hers, sincere and unwavering. "The truth is, I noticed you in town months ago with your baby. You always held your head high, never asked for help even when anyone could see you were struggling. I admired that, but it worried me too." Daisy stared at him, speechless. "I rode by your place a few times just to check from a distance," he continued. "That day I finally approached, I'd been working up the courage for weeks." "Why?" Daisy finally managed to ask. Garrett's smile was soft in the moonlight. "Because some things are worth fighting for, even if you might get turned away." He reached across the space between their horses to touch her gloved hand. "I'm not asking anything of you, Daisy. It's too soon, I know that. I just wanted you to understand that you and Thomas, you matter to me. More than as employees or neighbors." The confession hung between them in the cold night air, as delicate and perfect as the snowflakes drifting around them. Daisy felt something shift inside her, not a betrayal of William's memory, but a gentle acknowledgement that life continued, that her heart wasn't frozen forever in grief. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. "I need time." "Time is something I have plenty of," Garrett replied with a gentle smile. As winter deepened, the ranch settled into a quieter rhythm. Cattle needed tending regardless of weather, but the pace slowed compared to the frenetic activity of other seasons. Daisy found herself with more time to consider her future and her growing feelings for Garrett. He never pressed her, never made her feel rushed or obligated. Instead, he continued teaching her about ranching, included her in discussions about spring planning, and spent evenings reading to Thomas while Daisy mended clothing by the fire. It was during one such evening in January, with a blizzard howling outside and the ranch house warm and secure against the elements, that Daisy realized she had fallen in love again. The knowledge didn't come as a lightning strike, but as a quiet certainty, like recognizing a familiar landscape after a long journey. Thomas, now nearly a year old and attempting his first wobbly steps, adored Garrett. He would squeal with delight whenever the rancher entered a room, reaching out with pudgy arms to be lifted high above Garrett's head. "He'll be riding before he can properly walk," Garrett commented one evening as Thomas crawled determinedly toward him. "Not if I have anything to say about it," Daisy replied with mock sternness. "At least wait until he's 2. Garrett laughed, the sound warming Daisy more than the crackling fire. "Yes, madam," he said, scooping up the baby and settling him on his knee. "Your mama makes the rules, young man." Best we both remember that. The casual domesticity of the moment struck Daisy suddenly how natural it felt, how right. The realization must have shown on her face because Garrett's expression softened as he met her gaze. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked quietly. Daisy took a deep breath. "I was thinking that Thomas and I have been here nearly 3 months now." "Has it been that long already?" Garrett's tone was careful, neutral. "Spring will be here before we know it," she continued. "Time to think about planting." Something flickered in Garrett's eyes, concern, perhaps disappointment. "The irrigation work should be well underway by then. Your fields will be ready." Daisy set aside her mending and moved to sit beside him on the sofa. "I've been thinking about that, about my homestead." And he prompted when she hesitated. "And I'm wondering if perhaps there might be another solution." Her voice was barely above a whisper now. "One that wouldn't require me to choose between my land and other considerations." Garrett went very still, Thomas still balanced on his knee. "What kind of solution did you have in mind, Daisy?" She met his eyes directly, summoning her courage. "The kind where two people who care about each other might consider combining their properties and their lives." For a moment, Garrett seemed unable to speak. Then, carefully settling Thomas on a blanket on the floor, he turned to face Daisy fully. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" he asked, his voice husky with emotion. "I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you, Garrett Valero," Daisy said, the words both terrifying and liberating. "I didn't expect to, I wasn't looking for it, but here we are." Garrett's face transformed with a joy so pure it took her breath away. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he reached for her hands. "Daisy Newcomb," he said softly, "I've been in love with you since I saw you standing in your doorway, shotgun in hand, too proud to admit you needed help but too loving a mother to turn it away." He squeezed her fingers gently. "I'd be honored beyond words if you'd consider becoming my wife." Tears welled in Daisy's eyes, but they were tears of happiness, not grief. "I would like that very much," she whispered. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a promise of a future neither had dared imagine just months before. Spring arrived with its particular western ferocity, sudden warm days followed by brief, violent snowstorms, the land gradually awakening from winter's grip. True to his word, Garrett's men began work on the irrigation system that would bring water to Daisy's fields. They were married on a perfect May morning, with Thomas, now walking confidently, serving as ring bearer with Mrs. Harris's assistance. The ceremony was held on the porch of what would soon be their home, Daisy's cabin, significantly expanded under Garrett's direction to accommodate their growing family. "A home should have roots in both families' histories," he'd explained when proposing the renovation instead of simply moving Daisy and Thomas into the ranch house. "This land is part of who you are, part of Thomas's heritage from his father. We'll honor that while building something new together." As summer ripened into autumn, the first crops flourished in Daisy's once barren fields, nourished by the creek water now flowing through carefully constructed irrigation channels. The cabin had been transformed into a comfortable home, with a nursery for Thomas and plenty of room for the family they both hoped to expand. 1 year to the day after Garrett had first appeared at her door, Daisy stood on the porch of their home, watching as he taught Thomas how to pet a gentle mare. Her hand rested on her stomach, where their child, just beginning to make its presence known, grew stronger each day. Pride had once nearly cost her everything. Now, looking at the life she'd built from the ashes of despair, Daisy understood that true strength sometimes meant accepting help, and that love often arrived in unexpected forms, like a cowboy noticing a hungry baby and a mother too proud to ask for help. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Valero," Garrett called, Thomas perched securely in front of him on the saddle. Daisy smiled, happiness warming her from within. "Just counting my blessings, Mr. Valero, and finding them too numerous to tally." His answering smile told her he understood completely, as he always did. From hunger to happiness, from isolation to belonging, their journey had only just begun, but the path ahead, though surely not without challenges, would be traveled together.